Hey everyone, good evening. Facebook, we are so excited to talk about social justice and infrastructure tonight. We have some incredible guests joining us, and I think it's going to be a really rich discussion. So, I want to start out by introducing myself. My name is Bernice. I am the regional director with For Future Florida in West Central Florida. So that means St. Pete and Tampa. That is my area. Super excited to be on with y'all tonight. I am going to toss it to my colleague Juan to introduce himself. Oh, Juan, you're on mute.
Oh my goodness, all the time, right? My name is Juan Moore, and I am the regional director of South Florida. So that's Miami-Dade, Broward County, and Palm Beach County. And I am so excited to have everybody here to have this discussion with us today.
Great. I want to take a second to introduce our wonderful guests. We have two awesome folks on. The first is Dana from Plan Hillsborough. Thanks so much for being on with us, Dana.
Thank you.
Oop. And we also have Lori from Broward for Progress. How are you doing tonight, Lori?
Good. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Thanks. So we are going to get started by tossing it to Dana to lead us through transportation, infrastructure, and equity.
Awesome. Thank you, Bernice. I'm also really grateful to have been invited to speak with everybody. So my name is Dana Lazarus. I have a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from the University of South Florida, and I do currently work for Plan Hillsborough. We are currently updating our non-discrimination plan, and we've actually retitled it our non-discrimination and equity plan. So as an agency, we've been looking at the history of discriminatory planning and what we can do to acknowledge, take responsibility for, and rectify the wrongs that happened throughout the past with the way that our infrastructure was planned and built. One thing that I say a lot is that inequity, especially racism, is built into the land. It's not just interactional, it's systemic in our physical surroundings. And another thing to think about is that all of this, everything around us was planned by somebody. It was somebody's vision 100 years ago. That's why we have cars and highways and the types of housing and where our housing is located and downtown and the suburbs. All of that was somebody's idea 50 years ago. And so what we can do right now is start visualizing what we want to see in 50 years. And we are the planners of today. So I really wanted to drive that point home. I'm an urban planner. There's probably four main actors in planning and infrastructure planning. Specifically, transportation planning is what I am talking about today. You have your planners, your engineers, your decision makers, and the public. And the decision makers ultimately make the decisions about what gets built. And that's been the case throughout history. So your elected officials, the people that you vote for, they're the ones who dictate how the money is spent and what's going to be built outside your house, outside your front door. The engineers design it. The planners study and have the big picture view of what we want to build. And then, of course, the public can also dictate all of that, especially if you know how the planning is done and when it's time to interact with those decision makers and tell them what you want. And planners are supposed to be listening to the public. So next slide, please. Thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm working on our local non-discrimination and equity plan for Plan Hillsborough. So one of the first things to note is that the development patterns today are the way that they are because of the way that the city developed at its inception. So in this slide, what I want to show you is on the left side, you have, this is our local redlined map. So every major metropolitan area, more or less, has one of these red line maps. It was created by this organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And it was basically like a speculation of where the good places to live were. And there's this report that was written by the HOLC. And when they published the red line map, it was in the 1930s, and they describe each of these areas. And one thing to note about those D areas, the hazardous areas in red, is that one of the major descriptors of those areas was about race, ethnicity, nation of origin, and how the people that lived there were undesirable people to have in your city, really. And if you look at, this is a map that we just created. It is what we call a dot density map. So each dot represents 10 people. And it actually shows the location of different people. And we use census data. So it's really important to fill out the census every year, so we know who lives in our metropolitan areas. And if you look at it, you can see that the races are still pretty much in the same place as they were back then. So, and back in the 1930s, Hillsborough County, which is the county that I live in and that I'm studying, was concentrated in the city of Tampa urban area. And as gentrification happened, as I'll show you in slides coming up with urban renewal, people were pushed out into the suburbs and displaced out into the suburbs. But for the most part, we have certain areas like East Tampa is still a Black community. And so the development patterns are very similar to where people were allowed to live back in the 1930s. Next slide, please. Thank you. As part of our non-discrimination plan update, we went out and just looked in these different communities, and there was a lot of things that we saw. We saw children walking without sidewalks. We saw people living at bus stops. We saw trash and power lines in people's front yards, and just general disrespect for people who walk and ride bikes. The bottom left picture is a photo that I took in West Tampa that I think is pretty striking, and it shows a brand new home right next to an older home that was probably built in maybe the 60s or 70s. So these are, again, the persisting conditions that we have in these areas today. Next slide.
And also, when you look at the map, you look at zoning. A lot of these neighborhoods, especially where I'm at in Miami-Dade, are zoned next to places that are undesirable to live by. You know what I'm saying? So,
exactly.
Yeah, it does show discrepancies when you're looking at the brown and Black communities, for sure.
Yeah, East Tampa in particular, and the Ybor City area is next to the industrial center of the city, the ports. A lot of people were longshoremen and workers. So that's where people were made to live. So then there's some other interesting data that we found just by looking at the data, looking at environmental justice, looking at the distribution of where highways are located and air quality impacts. You know, we found that if you live in a community of concern, you are 13% more exposed to poor air quality as a result of living next to a high volume road. We also found that you're 20% more likely to be in a severe crash. So underserved communities of concern, those are just words that we have used to identify Black and brown communities, low income communities, communities with a higher concentration of people with disabilities and older communities. And we've also got data that shows where people with zero vehicles live. And so we aggregate this data. We look at kind of the intersection of like where there's a high concentration of all of those different populations. And that's what we identify as community of concern or underserved communities. So then we look at the physical location of where those people are, and we're able to overlay different maps like crashes, like high crash corridors, and the asthma, the respiratory hazard index, where people live, and see where there is more incidents. Next slide, please. There's also disparate impacts in housing and home ownership. So first of all, here in Hillsborough County, we have a higher renter-occupied percentage of our housing units than in the state of Florida by a pretty large margin. Like almost half of our housing units are renter-occupied, 40.10% there you see on the chart. If you break it down even further, people who rent are very cost burdened here. 42.3% spend 42.3% of our population spends 35% or more of their income on housing. And HUD considers 30% a significant cost burden. So we are very cost burdened here. But then you break it down even further, and it's not evenly distributed. There is a greater proportion of people of color who rent. So in the table on the right, the percentage proportion of the population in Hillsborough County is in the column to the far right. And then the percentage of, how many people, or what the proportion is of owners versus renters, you can see that a higher proportion of white alone people own property, own their home, than the proportion in the county versus a lesser proportion rent. But that's flipped when you look at the Black or African American alone. A much lower proportion of people rent than what they make up in the county versus renters. So I hope that graph is clear. It's kind of difficult for me to describe, but that is what the data shows. This is census data from 2019. Next slide, please. So how did planning get us here? Why are there disproportionate impacts? So like I said, with our non-discrimination plan, we started looking at the history of planning in a very real way. And we are committing to letting that inform how we plan moving forward. So there's kind of like three different areas that we looked at and how planning got us here. Again, Hillsborough County sort of developed most between the years 1900 and 1964. And between those times, there was a lot of political dynamics. We had our first comprehensive planning and zoning plans that were written. And there was some federal laws and that took place and led to urban renewal, public and private housing being developed, and of course, highway construction, almost a destruction. And the major act to know about when it comes to the highway construction and urban renewal is the Interstate and Defense Act of 1956. This act provided most of the funding for our highways. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the politics of the time when our infrastructure was planned and built is very important to understand. A lot of stuff isn't very directly documented, especially past a certain point, like past like the 1940s or so. They weren't as explicit about why they were putting certain developments in certain places. One thing that we found when we started doing research is that the city of Tampa had its own political party that was called the White Municipal Party. Between 1908 and 1956, every consecutive mayor of the city of Tampa was a White Municipal Party member. So these are the folks who wrote our plans and got to make those decisions about how our city was going to be developed and the transportation that was going to be developed here and where. So it's one thing to look at when you're doing your research on what happened. Next slide, please. And so again, during these times, the planners of the time, they weren't necessarily called planners back then, but the people who had the power to write plans and create these maps of what they wanted. The first major plan for Tampa was written in 1941. And I'm not going to read the quote verbatim, but they did essentially specifically say that the streets were a good way to move people of color around and to do what they would call slum clearance. And so these were the words that were used and the plans that were some of the plans that were created here in our local area. Next slide. And between the funding that became available for public housing and the funding that became available for highway construction with the Interstate and Defense Act of 1956 that I mentioned, and these plans to create this bustling, like, super highway mecca in all of the cities across the country, they drew out right on paper where they wanted the highways to go locally. And so this was the Dobbyville area. This was what you see here in Tampa. It's like in the West Tampa area. Dobbyville, I'm sorry, I think I mispronounced it, was a Black community. It was technically a Black suburb at the time, and they built the highway over it. Next slide, please. Did I freeze or did everyone else freeze?
You froze for a second, but you're back.
Okay, sorry. Next slide, please. I don't know. Hopefully you heard what I didn't say much, but I can explain more. So, and then here's another snapshot of where they drew the lines for where the highway was going to go. In the 1930s, 1940s, when they were planning these highways. So the Fortune Street neighborhood, Fortune Taylor was a Black woman who had been enslaved, who actually was owned the most land in downtown Tampa at the time, and she grew orange groves, and she had a whole neighborhood there. So that got displaced when the highway was built. The Grand Central District was the Black downtown of Tampa, so that was also displaced. And then Ybor City off to the right was also a Black and Latino and Jewish and Italian area that got built over. Next slide, please. And so this is just a visualization of kind of like the before and after here in Tampa between 1938 and this other picture on the right was 2018. So we had homes, businesses, downtowns. We had a beautiful grid network that made it very easy to walk or bike around to get to school, to get to work. And with some federal money and certain people planning at the time and certain decision makers, this is what we end up with on the right. This is why things are the way they are. Next slide, please. And so again, right now, we are trying to do better. With the protests that happened early last year, a lot of companies and government agencies and entities had these, emergency meetings about, well, what are we going to do? Like, it was a moment that was leveraged by a lot of different agencies and companies that didn't get, published or publicized that was happening. But so last summer, Plan Hillsborough decided to hire some people and do a process to right the wrongs of the past. And there is federal precedent for doing so. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are interpretations of Title VI and of the Civil Rights Act that say that, we have to take action to take responsibility for the badges of slavery, and arguments that what we see physically and with the highway, we are obligated to look at that and do something about it. So anyways, this is just a list of different acts that very specifically says we actually need to do something to plan our infrastructure for certain communities. Again, for Americans with disabilities, for example. And you'll also notice that most of these are in the second half of the last century. So somewhat new, and we are just trying to do better all the time. Next slide, please. And the way that we have decided to do that is, like, first we had to actually define equity, because a lot of government agencies haven't actually defined equity. They're still operating off of this old definition of what needs to be done. In 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, it was defined as, the goal was equality. And as long as, governments and people weren't allowed to discriminate, I guess they figured everything would just even out eventually. But again, we have the data that shows that hasn't happened. And so now we're looking at equity, which is more of the road to equality, looking at how people are disproportionately impacted and passively excluded from decision-making processes. So we identified this 5-component definition of equity for our work. A definition of equity might look different depending on the sector or what you're talking about. Like housing equity might look different than transportation equity. So this was ours for basically public space and mobility equity. And we're looking at the distribution of the benefits and burdens of transportation. So the benefits of good sidewalks, connected sidewalks, lighting, trees and shade. Where does the bus route go? And even who has access to a personal vehicle, and access to the routes that they can get to work quicker in their personal vehicle. And then we also look at, again, the burdens, like who's getting asthma, who's getting diabetes, from breathing in particulate matter from the highway. And whose homes are being taken for the right of way for highway expansion. And then, there's other components. Recognition is a big one. Simply acknowledging that there's an entire history of decisions that led us to this point is kind of different for government to do. So that's a component of our definition that I'm definitely hoping spreads. And it seems to be something that the White House is doing, is recognizing the history of decisions and how that impacted where we are today. I also want to point out the procedure component, because procedure really looks at who is making the decisions and how is the public leading. So next slide, please. Those are the main ones I wanted to hit on. So finally, moving forward with transportation infrastructure, what are some things that we should be focusing on? to improve equity and to really improve the quality of life of like everybody, because just when there's bad decisions made, it always ends up affecting everybody. We're all connected. So what I heard during the public engagement process that we did for the non-discrimination plan. So what we did is we actually we used a map again to identify where the high concentrations of low income Black and brown people, people with disabilities, people with zero cars live. And we actually went door to door, and we actually used grassroots strategies to meet people where they're at and ask people about access and discrimination that they have faced and that they experience. And so between that process, which we did just this past year between December 2020 and March 2021, and best practices research, people said, especially here locally, we do have a bus system. And so we should be improving our bus system first. We have the infrastructure already, and people are already using it and already relying on it. And then also improving safety design and infrastructure, because here, again, locally in Hillsborough County, we're in the top 3 most dangerous places to walk and bike in the country. And then for housing, the key there is revitalization, not gentrification. So people are seeing, again, right here in Tampa and Hillsborough County, there's a ton of displacement happening, a ton of gentrification happening. And in order to allow people to stay where they are and actually reap the benefits of development. So like, sure, government can go in and build a bike lane, but if that just inspires a developer to come and develop that space and displace everybody who already lives there, then it didn't actually serve that existing community. So the key is to kind of package or bundle policies and programs that help raise people's wealth and help allow people to stay in that community through like affordable housing, raising the minimum wage, jobs trainings programs, that kind of thing. And also investing in every community, and making sure that like all the good stuff that exists in our community isn't just in the wealthy white parts of the community. And so those are some of the big ideas for improving housing. And then, of course, across all infrastructure development like transportation should be led by the people and not so technocratic or like behind, these gatekeepers or closed door, shouldn't happen behind closed doors. And we need to be doing a better job at outreach to people, meeting people where they are, making sure that people understand like how all this stuff happens, and letting people speak for themselves on what they need, and then actually listening. And so that being said, I did want to plug our website. Like locally, if you're watching this from Hillsborough County, again, Plan Hillsborough is our transportation planning agency, and it's planhillsborough.org. And we have a calendar where the board meets, and you can speak your mind, tell them what you need, tell them what you want to see, if you want to see a better bus system, if you want to see rail, that kind of thing. They need to hear from you. Please do reach out to me. Oh, next slide. I think that was the last one. So that's my contact information, and I'd love to help anybody get connected with their local planning agency and talk about how planning happens and anything that you want to talk about with transportation development. So that's it. Thank you for me.
Thank you so much, Dana, and really appreciate it. And we're so lucky to have you on. Part of the reason why we wanted to have Dana on was to share a lot of the history. I don't know about y'all on the panel, but I was kind of shocked to hear that well, I guess I shouldn't be shocked that there was like a white municipal party, but I was kind of shocked to hear that there was one, and how much like race went into and factored into urban planning. And part of the reason why we wanted to talk about that history is because we have some legislation today that President Biden has proposed that will address some, not all, I think, but some, and a good amount of what Dana was talking about and sharing with us. So just to share like a couple key points about the bipartisan infrastructure plan. It is going to transform our infrastructure. So it's going to modernize our highways, roads, our main streets. It's going to invest in public transportation, which is so needed. Next, it has racial equity built into the plan. And so there are going to be historic investments made into these disadvantaged communities. And it will create green jobs that are going to prioritize hiring people of color. And it will also invest in clean energy. So thinking about like how this plan will benefit our environment as well, it's going to shift tax incentives away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy.
Absolutely, it's not just a maintenance plan. I mean, a lot of our government leaders now they don't put money into growth. It's more so of maintenance. I could remember since I was a little kid, our turnpike being fixed. You walk outside right now, it's being maintained on. I think it leads to the same place for the most part here where I'm at. But I also want to point out that Bernice, you said earlier, you couldn't imagine a time, and it's hard to imagine a time since that time. However, if you look at our senators, our governor has just allowed SB 1 to be admitted in our state. So you can see that possibly happening to where a larger demographic of those that are able to vote on these issues that surround us that don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that I like about the plan is the investment in public infrastructure, and specifically in public transportation. And so we know that public transportation, it takes, I think, typically twice as long for folks to commute if they take public transportation. So just thinking about how it's going to improve the lives of folks, specifically communities of color, to have an improved like public transportation system is amazing.
There was a study done that said that commute time is the number one factor in upward mobilization.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I can try to find it and share it with you.
That's really cool. Next, we have fixing our crumbling infrastructure. I don't know about y'all. I know, and maybe, I don't know, this is something, Lori, that you see, but the infrastructure here in Tampa, like the roads are terrible, especially South Tampa. Like the flooding gets to be so bad when it rains. So part of what this plan will do is actually fix our crumbling, our roads, our bridges, and our buildings. And when we think about like the tragedy that happened in Surfside, this is like, this is one of those things that maybe we can prevent future structural tragedies.
Yeah, I just want to comment on Dana's presentation. First of all, that was phenomenal, and also very terrifying to see how systemic and how long this discrimination has been occurring, and how it's really fresh, like it's so recent. And I think it also gives credibility to all of us who say you really need to hold your leaders accountable, because the reality is we didn't get here by chance. This was planned, right? And so we are at the moment in history as a nation, as a people, to hold our leaders accountable. And this infrastructure bill is a great way to do that. We have so much opportunity presented in the infrastructure bill for many of the reasons that you described. I'm also very excited about the high-speed rail. I think that is something that it says it's tenfold. It'll come back. It's clean energy. But going back to what Dana said earlier, something that when you were presenting all the time in my head, I kept thinking about our broken metro system here in South Florida and how much resources we as a state will invest in roads or highways going to suburbia, but we will neglect our urban centers, and that's just shameful. And I'm excited that this can address some of those issues. And the other thing I want to shout out, I really liked your equity plan there. I thought that was amazing. I wish that our leaders in Tallahassee, that was you have to go by this. I really do. It was amazing. I wish they all pulled that out as a way of addressing some of the issues our community sees. But definitely there are so many good things in the upcoming infrastructure plan. I'm excited to see what else y'all have in there. But definitely it's just alarming. And we have to learn as a population in Florida that nothing concedes without our demand. And we're at a point in history where we have to demand better for all of us. There is no liberty and justice when it's only for a few. And we have to do better as community members, making sure that our leaders hear from us and they are held accountable, and that we demand that these infrastructure fixes have to happen, and we furthermore have to implement better solutions. And I love the part about revitalization, right? Because we're in this mentality as a society, well, it's broken, just throw it out or rebuild it. And that isn't always the best solution. And looking at that map that you earlier showed us, I think that's a great example. What it shows is that wasn't necessarily the best solution. It didn't solve the problems that we need. So yeah, thank you for including me in this, and very eye-opening and good information in here.
Thank you for being on, Lori. We're so lucky to have you and Dana. So just super appreciative of our guests today. Y'all are awesome. Clean, safe drinking water. This is one that kind of blows my mind still, but almost 50,000 people in Florida were exposed to unsafe lead levels in drinking water in about a 3-year period. And a lot of kids, thousands of kids test at lead levels that the CDC says isn't safe. So the infrastructure plan is going to replace 100% of all the lead pipes in the country, which is amazing. So we will have clean drinking water in all of our states across the country. So not only are all these other amazing things going to happen, but we will actually be creating jobs through this plan. And so this plan will invest in creating jobs as well, because there's so much that needs to be done to fix our infrastructure. We are going to be able to help those folks, over 500,000 right now who are unemployed. We're going to be able to help those folks get back to work. So this is a plan that's going to solve so many problems. It's going to help fix our infrastructure. It's going to move us towards clean energy, and it's creating jobs. So it's doing a lot of things at once. And one of my favorite parts, or probably the best part about this is not going to cost you or me or anyone on this call any money. This plan is paid for by taxing the ultra rich and mega corporations and making sure that they pay their fair share. So right now we have a quick call to action, which is asking everyone if they can contact Senators Rubio and Scott. We know that every vote counts. We have a 50-50 Senate. So call them today and urge them to vote for the bipartisan plan that's going to prevent infrastructure tragedies. tragedies rather, save lives, and get Floridians back to work. So we are going to drop that link in the comments for you that will help y'all make that call.
And please definitely call them. That's one way you can get involved. I want to remind everybody, we're all comfortable now. We have our child tax credits. You're safe in your house. Although our COVID levels are extremely low, let's not forget that Rubio or Scott never signed off on the American Rescue Plan. If it was up to them, we wouldn't even have this. They didn't sign off on the American Jobs Plan. Look what they're doing with some of these pieces of legislation. So we need them to get on board. We need them to get active. We need them to stop running for president or whatever they're doing in their mind. We're in the middle of a pandemic. A building has just crushed and killed hundreds of people. One of the worst catastrophes when you're talking about infrastructure. So please get on the phone, leave a message, say, hey, sign on the American Infrastructure Plan. That's going to be next week. You have time to make a change. You have time to get active. And it's so funny that we have to be asking our leaders to wake up when we're all here suffering.
I would just like to comment on that. A lot of times I hear people say that, oh, they're not going to change their mind. Why should I call? It's not going to make a difference. And I will just point out that all the changes that we've had in history, good people really push those leaders. Now, my job as a mom or as a community member or as an activist is not to do Senator Rubio or Senator Scott's job. My job is to hold my leaders accountable. So I can make excuses or I can do my job. And so I'm going to pick up the phone every single day. They're both on speed dial. And I'm going to let them know you work for us. You work for the people of Florida. And, I'm hoping every single day that they will do what they're supposed to do. But regardless, I still have a job to do. So I encourage anybody that has given up hope, and our senators, do not give up hope. Because if people had given up hope years ago, we wouldn't have seen changes that we've seen in this nation. So keep pushing, keep fighting, hold them accountable. That's our job. We can do this, but we need more of us making those calls.
Laura, you're amazing. Thank you for that. And like our infrastructure, our transportation infrastructure has a shelf life. These materials don't last very long. They last 50 to 60 years before they have to be replaced. And that, that's why our infrastructure is crumbling all over, is because it hasn't been funded. We haven't gotten the support from the federal government that we need. And so our infrastructure, our roads, everything, it's going to continue to crumble if we don't fund it. And just like in 1956, the federal government invested all this money in the transportation, beautiful system that they wanted to see. It's absolutely time for us to do that now with a different and better vision.
And what about bringing all these jobs? Think of all the jobs that are going to be created in Florida. And why are we living in the Sunshine State depending on fossil fuels? Why are we not protecting our beaches, our waterways, our airway, all of that in the Sunshine State? So the infrastructure bill is the way to do that. Imagine we have good infrastructure, high-speed rail, mass transportation, and we work on cleaning up our waterways. We shouldn't be having dead fish on our beaches. The reality is this state depends on tourism and fishing. When we are polluting our waterways and obstructing the opportunity as a solar state, you're actually harming our children's future and our ability to make a living. I mean, this is only getting worse. So we have to make these calls now. We have to push these leaders hard. We need these changes for our future. We have to do this. We are the Sunshine State. We're the beautiful Florida Sunshine State, and we have this opportunity, but time is slipping away. It's time is of the essence. So if you're hearing our voices, make those calls, push your senators, push hard. We need them to take action on the infrastructure bill.
I would add just a couple facts about why it's particularly important for Florida. There's something happening called the Sun Belt migration, where everybody's moving to Florida Right now, we have incredible population increase estimates happening. In Hillsborough alone, we're expecting 700,000 new people by 2040. And so, you know, we do need the funding. We need the investment. And I don't remember my other point, but if I think of it, I'll let you know. But we have a particular need in Florida to invest in alternative. So like we actually have more nicer days than they do in other parts of the country and the world where they have invested in the bus system, in walk and bike infrastructure. Like Florida is actually the perfect place to walk and bike. If we just, again, plant the shade trees and actually have well thought out and well designed infrastructure, we can have it all here. It's really, we have fantastic weather and people are coming. So let the senators know that it's the time.
Definitely. And just before we hop off here today, I want to hear from each of our guests. What's the best way that folks can stay connected with you or with your organization?
So I'll go first. My organization is Broward for Progress, and you can visit us at browardforprogress.org. We have an action on our Take Action page, and I'll have a link dropped in there. If you can click through, you can send a letter to both senators to stop obstructing and actually start representing the people of Florida on many issues. So please visit our website, browardforprogress.org, and we also, of course, are on social media as well.
I mentioned earlier, planhillsborough.org is our website. But if you want to reach me personally, my email is dayanalaz@gmail.com. And I'm always happy to speak with anybody or talk.
Awesome. And last thing I'll say before we go is For Our Future is hosting an exciting training that's coming up on Tuesday. It's our BFF training, our Blue Future Fighters, although I do think a blue future is a bright future for Florida as well. And so we would love to have y'all come out to that. It's Tuesday at 7. It's going to be a Zoom. It'll be a great big statewide training, and we're going to talk about how we can defeat Rubio and DeSantis as well. So please sign up for that. We are dropping the link in the comments.
The best volunteer program around. It's been created and structured to have you guys enjoy and learn how to be active. So there's going to be LTE trainings. There's going to be phone banks. There's going to be dialers, text banks, ways you can be involved. And it's going to be a huge coalition. So please sign up for that training and join the Blue Future Fighters, for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I feel like I learned so much tonight. Super, super grateful to Lori and Dana for being on with us. And I hope that everyone has a wonderful night. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.